My husband told me to clean up the glass while his mistress laughed, but I walked away instead. The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, but Deborah Edwards barely flinched. 27 years of marriage. And this was the moment. Standing in her own kitchen while her husband's mistress laughed from the doorway, while Frank told her to clean it up and stop embarrassing him in front of his guest. The glass wasn't the only thing breaking. Something inside Deborah cracked open too, and what poured out wasn't tears. It was fury, and it was finally awake. But let's back up, because the woman standing in that kitchen didn't arrive there overnight. She'd been disappearing for years, one small surrender at a time, until the day she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. Deborah Edwards was 52 years old, and if you'd asked anyone in her affluent suburban neighborhood to describe her, they'd use words like gracious, accommodating, the perfect hostess. Frank's wife. Always Frank's wife first, Deborah second. She'd left her teaching career 15 years earlier when Frank's commercial real estate business took off. It made sense at the time. He needed her support. Olive was still in middle school and the money was good. Very good. Good enough that Deborah could volunteer at the local library, run a book club, manage their immaculate home with its designer furniture and perfectly coordinated throw pillows. From the outside, it looked like a dream. 4,000 square feet of marble countertops and hardwood floors, a walk-in closet the size of most people's bedrooms, European vacations twice a year, though Frank usually worked through them, the kind of life women's magazines called aspirational. But if you'd looked closer, if anyone had, you'd have seen the cracks. The way Frank introduced her at dinner parties with that dismissive little laugh. This is my wife, Deborah. She handles the home front, as if running a household and raising a daughter required no intelligence, no skill, no value worth mentioning. The way he'd joke about her being high maintenance when she asked for new tires on the car, how he'd cut her off mid-sentence when she was speaking, finishing her thoughts as if she couldn't be trusted to complete them herself. The bedroom that had become his alone 3 years ago, because he needed better sleep for work, leaving Deborah in the guest room like a visitor in her own home. She'd learned to measure her days by his moods, his schedule, his needs. Wake at 5:30 to prepare his breakfast exactly how he liked it. 2 eggs over medium, wheat toast barely browned, orange juice in the crystal glass he preferred. She'd check her reflection 3 times before he came downstairs, making sure her hair was neat, her clothes pressed, her smile ready, as if she were staff preparing for inspection rather than a wife greeting her husband. The morning routine was a performance she'd perfected over the years. She knew which topics were safe for conversation: his business deals, his golf game, local news that didn't require too much opinion. She knew which topics to avoid, anything about her own thoughts, her own desires, her own disappointments. Those were landmines that led to his irritation, his sighs, his inevitable dismissal. "You're being dramatic, Deborah. You're overthinking things. Can't you just be happy with what you have?" So she'd learned to be quiet, to smile, to agree, to shrink. Her afternoons at the library were the only hours she felt like herself. There, in the adult literacy program where she volunteered, helping people learn to read, she remembered who she'd been before she became Frank's wife. She'd been a teacher once, and a good one. She had a master's degree in education that she barely mentioned anymore because Frank said it made her sound pretentious. But when she sat across from a struggling reader, watching the moment letters transformed into words, words into meaning, meaning into possibility, in those moments she felt competent, valuable, seen. The rest of the time, she was invisible. Her book club met monthly in her living room, a gathering of well-dressed women who discussed literary fiction and drank expensive wine. But even there, Deborah had learned to soften her opinions, to agree with the loudest voices, to smooth over disagreements before they became uncomfortable. She'd become an expert at keeping peace, at making everyone else comfortable, at ensuring no one felt threatened or challenged or upset. It had become her entire identity. the woman who made things easy for everyone else. The cost of that ease was herself. Her phone calls with Diana Rosewood, her college roommate who'd moved to Colorado 15 years ago, had become shorter over the years. Not because they'd grown apart, but because Deborah had less and less truth to share. "How are you?" "Fine." "How's Frank?" "Busy." "How's Olive?" "Good, staying busy with grad school." The surface-level updates of someone who'd forgotten how to be honest, even with her oldest friend. Diana would ask pointed questions sometimes. "When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" "When's the last time Frank asked about your day?" But Deborah would deflect, change the subject, keep the conversation light. It was easier than admitting the truth she could barely admit to herself. Her daughter Olive, 22 and brilliant, studying social work at a graduate program 3 hours away, had been distant for the past year. Their text exchanges were brief, surface level. Deborah sensed disappointment radiating from her daughter, but couldn't pinpoint why. She told herself Olive was just busy, focused on her studies, building her own life. She didn't let herself consider that maybe Olive was disappointed in her mother, that maybe watching Deborah disappear year after year had taught Olive something Deborah never intended, that women's voices don't matter, that accommodation is the same as love, that shrinking yourself is the price of security. And then there was Judith, Frank's mother, who called every week to check that Deborah was taking good care of my son. The calls always carried the same subtext. Edward's women hold their families together. Edward's women don't complain. Edward's women know their place. Judith had been married to Frank's father for 43 years before he died. 43 years of yes, dear, and of course, dear, and whatever you think is best, dear. She expected Deborah to follow the same script, and for 27 years, Deborah had obliged. The beliefs that kept her trapped were so deeply embedded, she didn't recognize them as beliefs anymore. They felt like facts. Marriage requires sacrifice, but only she was sacrificing. A good wife supports her husband's dreams. Her own dreams had vanished so long ago, she couldn't remember what they'd been. I'm lucky he provides well. Financial security had become her prison, and the bars were made of her own fear. It's not that bad. The lie she told herself every morning. I'm too old to start over. The fear that kept her frozen in place, year after year, disappearing a little more with each passing season. But fear has a way of accumulating, building pressure, until something has to give. It was their 27th wedding anniversary week. Frank had announced, not asked, that he was inviting business associates for dinner at their home. Deborah had spent 3 days preparing, researching recipes, shopping for ingredients, polishing silver that hadn't been used in months, arranging flowers, ironing the good linens. She'd wanted everything to be perfect. Some part of her still believed that if she could just be perfect enough, he might notice her, might see her, might remember why he'd married her in the first place. She'd bought a new dress for the occasion, navy blue with a subtle pattern, elegant but not too flashy, something that said, I made an effort without demanding too much attention. She'd spent an hour on her hair and makeup, trying to look put together but effortless, as if beauty came naturally at 52 and didn't require strategic lighting and expensive concealer. Frank hadn't noticed. Not the dress, not the effort, not the 3 days of preparation evident in every detail of the dining room. He'd walked through the house with barely a glance, checking his phone, adjusting his tie. It's what you do, isn't it? As if her worth could be measured in perfectly folded napkins and properly chilled wine. The business associates turned out to be a single person, a woman in her 30s, beautiful in that effortless way that comes from youth and confidence and not having spent 27 years being slowly erased. Michelle. Frank introduced her casually, as if her presence at an anniversary dinner was perfectly normal. This is Michelle. She's been instrumental in closing the Riverside deal. His hand lingered on her shoulder a moment too long. His smile was warmer than any he'd directed at Deborah in years. Deborah felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she did what she'd been trained to do, smiled, welcomed Michelle, poured wine, served the meal she'd spent days perfecting. She played the role of gracious hostess while watching her husband light up in a way he never did for her anymore. The way Michelle looked at Frank. The way Frank looked at Michelle. The way neither of them really looked at Deborah at all, except when they needed something. More wine, the salt, permission to ignore her existence. She'd made champagne to celebrate. Their anniversary. 27 years. A number that suddenly felt less like an achievement and more like a sentence served. Frank raised his glass in a toast to successful partnerships. He was looking at Michelle when he said it. The glass was slippery in Deborah's trembling hands, or maybe her hands were shaking because somewhere deep in her body, in the part of herself she'd buried and ignored and silenced, something was waking up, something that recognized betrayal when it was served alongside perfectly roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes. Michelle's hand landed on Frank's shoulder, too familiar, too comfortable, too knowing, and Deborah's frozen smile cracked just enough that her fingers loosened, just enough that the champagne flute slipped, just enough that everything shattered. The crystal hit the marble with a sound like a gunshot in the perfect silence of her perfect dining room. Champagne spread across the floor in a golden puddle, catching the light from the chandelier she'd spent an hour cleaning that morning, and Michelle laughed, not an embarrassed, oh dear laugh, but something else, something that sounded almost like triumph. Deborah stared at the broken glass, at the puddle spreading toward her expensive rug, at the sharp fragments glittering like tiny accusatory mirrors, each one reflecting a version of herself she no longer recognized. And then Frank's voice, sharp with irritation. "Deborah, for God's sake, clean that up. You're embarrassing me. Not are you okay? Not let me help." Not even an acknowledgement of the scene he'd created by bringing his mistress to their anniversary dinner. A command. An expectation, an assumption that her role, as always, was to clean up messes, even the ones he made. Something in Deborah's chest cracked open. Not her heart breaking. That had been breaking slowly for years. This was different. This was something sealed tight, finally splitting wide, and what poured out wasn't sadness or pain. It was clarity, sharp and bright and unforgiving as the broken glass at her feet. How long? Her voice surprised her. It was steady, clear. Not the apologetic murmur she'd perfected over 27 years. How long has this been going on? Frank's face shifted from irritation to something else. Calculation. He glanced at Michelle, who was gathering her purse with practiced efficiency, clearly ready to leave before the scene became messier. Then back to Deborah. "Does it matter? You're not going anywhere." 6 words. Casual, certain, dismissive. 6 words that contained 27 years of truth she'd been refusing to see. He wasn't worried about her reaction because he didn't believe she was capable of leaving. She had no job, no income, no savings of her own. The house was in his name, bought before they married. The cars, the accounts, the investments, all his. She was 52 years old with a 15-year gap in her resume and a master's degree that felt more like ancient history than relevant credential. Where would she go? What would she do? He'd built a cage so slowly, so carefully, that she hadn't noticed she was trapped until this moment, standing in broken glass, watching his mistress walk toward the door with her husband's hand on her lower back. Michelle paused at the entrance to the dining room, looking back with something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. I should go. Not an apology, just an inconvenience. Frank walked her out, murmuring something Deborah couldn't hear, his solicitousness a stark contrast to the contempt he'd just shown his wife. Deborah stood alone in the dining room she'd spent days perfecting. The candles she'd lit flickered in their holders. The flowers she'd arranged drooped slightly in their vase. The meal she'd cooked grew cold on abandoned plates. Everything perfect and beautiful and meaningless. She didn't clean up the glass. She walked upstairs instead, her feet carrying her automatically to the master bedroom, the room that had stopped being theirs and became his 3 years ago. She stood in the doorway, looking at the king-sized bed she no longer slept in, the closet full of his perfectly pressed suits, the bathroom counter where his things spread across every available surface while hers were relegated to a drawer. When had she stopped belonging here? Or had she ever really belonged at all? She heard the front door close, Frank's footsteps returning. She waited for him to come upstairs, to explain, to apologize, to acknowledge what had just happened. Instead, she heard him in the kitchen, the sound of the dishwasher opening, dishes clattering. He was cleaning up, as if the problem was the mess and not the betrayal, as if everything could go back to normal once the broken glass was swept away. Deborah gathered her pillow and the book from her nightstand, the one she'd been reading in the guest room where she actually slept now. She walked to that smaller bedroom, the one with the single window and the bed that was too narrow and the walls that were bare, because she'd never bothered to decorate a room that was supposed to be temporary. She locked the door, a small act of defiance that felt enormous. She lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through 27 years of moments she'd ignored or explained away, or simply endured. The pattern was so clear now, so obvious. She couldn't believe she'd missed it. Or maybe she hadn't missed it. Maybe she'd just chosen not to see. Morning came too soon. She heard Frank moving around downstairs, the familiar sounds of his morning routine, coffee brewing, the television news on low volume, the front door opening for the newspaper, normal sounds, expected sounds, sounds that suggested nothing had changed, nothing mattered, everything would continue exactly as it had been. She waited for him to come upstairs, to check on her, to say something, anything about the night before. He didn't. By 8 o'clock, she heard his car start in the driveway. He was leaving for work, without a word, without acknowledgement, as if their anniversary dinner hadn't ended with his mistress in their home and his wife sleeping in the guest room. Deborah sat on the edge of the too narrow bed and felt something new settle in her chest. Not quite courage, that would come later, but something close, something that whispered, quietly but persistently, "You deserve better than this." She didn't believe it yet, not fully, but she heard it. And that, somehow, was a beginning. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because Deborah's journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens when she finally stops shrinking. The house felt different in Frank's absence, lighter, quieter in a way that was peaceful rather than oppressive. Deborah made herself coffee. Real coffee, not the weak half-calf Frank preferred, and sat at the kitchen island staring at the spot where the champagne glass had shattered. Frank had cleaned it up, but she could still see it in her mind, the way the crystal had exploded into fragments, the way something inside her had done the same. She waited for Frank to come home that evening, some part of her still expecting an explanation, an apology, something that would make sense of what had happened. He arrived at 7, carrying takeout from his favorite restaurant. He set it on the counter, loosened his tie, and turned to her with a look of mild annoyance. "I hope you're satisfied. You've made this incredibly awkward. Not, I'm sorry. Not, we need to talk. But blame. As if she'd caused the problem by dropping a glass, by existing in the moment of his betrayal, by having the audacity to witness what she wasn't supposed to see. Deborah felt that crack inside her widen. Made what awkward, Frank? The situation with Michelle. She's important to the business. I can't afford your dramatics right now. My dramatics. She tested the words, trying them out. You brought your mistress to our home, on our anniversary, and I'm being dramatic? Don't be hysterical. It's not like that. But his face told a different story. It was exactly like that. And they both knew it. How long? She asked again, needing the answer even though part of her knew the truth would hurt worse than the wondering. Frank sighed, the sound of a man inconvenienced by having to explain himself. Does it matter? It's not serious, just stress relief. as if infidelity could be categorized like a business expense, as if the years of her life, her fidelity, her dedication meant so little they could be dismissed with just stress relief. It matters to me. Her voice was still steady, which surprised her. Inside, she felt like she was falling apart, but her voice held firm. Then you need to get over it. Frank opened the takeout bag, pulling out containers as if they were having a normal conversation about a normal day. Michelle and I have a working relationship. Sometimes these things happen. You'd understand if you had any idea what kind of pressure I'm under. There it was, the pivot. The way he made everything about him, his stress, his needs, his justifications. And somehow, without her quite knowing how, he made it her fault for not understanding, not supporting, not being enough. I want you to leave. The words came out before she'd fully formed the thought. Frank stopped, a container of pad thai halfway to the counter. His expression shifted from irritation to something like amusement. Excuse me? I want you to leave. This is my house, too. I want you to go. He laughed then. Actually laughed, as if she'd told a joke. This is my house, Deborah. I bought it before we got married. My name is on the deed. I'm not going anywhere. The legal truth of it hit her like cold water. The house was his, not theirs, his. She'd lived here for 23 years, raised their daughter here, made it a home, but legally it belonged to him. Frank set down the takeout and turned to face her fully. Let's be realistic. You have nowhere to go. No job, no income, no savings of your own. So let's stop this melodrama and get back to normal. Shall we? Each word was a stone, weighted with truth she couldn't deny. She had nothing. He'd made sure of it slowly and carefully over 27 years. Every decision that limited her, leaving her career, putting everything in his name, giving her an allowance instead of access to accounts, had been presented as practical, sensible, what's best for the family. She'd agreed to all of it, never seeing the trap until she was fully inside it. That night, she stayed in the guest room again. Frank didn't try to talk to her, didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge anything was wrong. He went about his evening routine as if nothing had changed, as if his wife sleeping in another room was perfectly normal, as if bringing his mistress to dinner was just an unfortunate misunderstanding that she'd overreacted to. For 3 days, they moved around each other like strangers. Deborah stopped preparing his breakfast, stopped timing her day to his schedule, stopped asking how his day was or what he needed or whether he'd be home for dinner. Small acts of refusal that felt enormous, revolutionary, terrifying. Frank's irritation grew with each small rebellion. Where's breakfast? Make it yourself. Why isn't dinner ready? I ate earlier. Where were you this afternoon? The library. You're being childish, Deborah. Am I? She could feel him waiting for her to fold, to return to normal, to apologize for making things uncomfortable. She could feel herself wanting to fold, the old patterns pulling at her like gravity. It would be so easy to slip back into the familiar rhythm of accommodation and silence. So easy to pretend nothing had happened, nothing had changed, nothing mattered enough to blow up her entire life over. But every time she felt herself wavering, she'd remember Michelle's laugh, Frank's command to clean up the glass, his casual certainty that she had nowhere to go. On the third night, at 2 a.m, lying awake in the too narrow guest bed, Deborah picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over Diana's name. She and Diana had been best friends since college, roommates for 4 years, bridesmaids at each other's weddings. But their friendship had become distant over the years, not from lack of love, but from lack of honesty. Deborah had edited herself so thoroughly in her marriage that she'd started editing herself everywhere else too, until she hardly knew what was real and what was performance anymore. She almost put the phone down. It was the middle of the night. Diana had her own life, her own problems, her own world 3 states away. What would Deborah even say? That her perfect marriage wasn't perfect? That she'd been lying to everyone, including herself, for years? That she was 52 and scared and lost and had no idea what to do next? but her finger pressed the call button before fear could stop her. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Diana's voice, groggy and concerned. "Deb, what's wrong?" And Deborah broke. The truth came pouring out. Not the edited version, not the manageable summary, but the real version. The affair, the humiliation, the years of dismissiveness and control and slow erasure. Frank's hand on Michelle's back, the way he'd commanded her to clean up the glass, the way he'd looked at her with such contempt, such certainty that she would stay, because she had nowhere else to go. "I don't know who I am anymore, Di." She was crying so hard she could barely speak. "I don't know who I am without him. I don't remember what I wanted, what I liked, what I thought about anything. I've spent so long being Frank's wife that I forgot to be Deborah." Silence on the other end of the line. Long enough that Deborah wondered if Diana had hung up, if even her oldest friend couldn't handle this level of truth. Then Diana's voice, soft but firm. "I've been waiting 20 years for you to tell me the truth. Not judgment, not surprise. Relief. I've watched you disappear, Deb. A little more every year. Every time we talked, there was less of you and more of what you thought you should say. I've been hoping you'd wake up." Diana's voice cracked. "I'm so glad you finally did." They talked for 2 hours. Diana asked questions Deborah had never asked herself. When's the last time you made a decision just for you? When's the last time you said no to something Frank wanted? When's the last time you felt like yourself? Deborah couldn't answer most of them. The silence where answers should be was devastating. Finally, Diana said what Deborah both needed and feared to hear. "You need to leave him." "I can't. I have no money, no job, nowhere to go." "Then we start there." Diana's voice became practical, focused. "First, you need money. Do you have access to any accounts? Just the household account. For groceries and household expenses. Frank handles everything else." "Okay, start documenting everything. Every dismissive comment, every controlling behavior, every time he makes a decision without you. You'll need evidence if you divorce." Diana paused. "And Deb, you need a job, your own income, your own life. Who would hire me? I haven't worked in 15 years. Someone who needs what you have to offer. You're a teacher, remember? You help people learn. Start there." After they hung up, Deborah sat in the dark guest room, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly. That was too strong. But possibility. The faint outline of a path forward, even if she couldn't see where it led. She pulled out her laptop, an old one Frank had given her years ago, slow and outdated but functional. She opened a job search site and just stared at it for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing. This felt simultaneously like the smallest and largest step she'd ever taken. Teacher positions. Nothing. She'd been out of the classroom too long, and schools wanted current certifications, recent experience, things she didn't have. Retail positions. She was overqualified, and they probably knew she'd leave the moment something better came along. Office work. Same problem. She wasn't young enough to be entry-level or experienced enough to be management. Each rejection, even the silent rejections of not being called for jobs she'd applied to, felt like confirmation of what Frank had said. She was unemployable, worthless in the job market, too old to start over. She was about to close the laptop when she remembered the library, her volunteer work with the adult literacy program. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, had mentioned something a few weeks ago about looking for volunteers to train as tutors, with the possibility of paid positions eventually. It wasn't much. Probably minimum wage, maybe a little more. Nothing compared to what Frank earned, nothing that would support the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. But it was something. A beginning. The smallest crack in the cage. Chapter 2. The next morning, Deborah went to the library during her usual volunteer shift. She found Mrs. Chen shelving books in the biography section, her reading glasses perched on top of her gray hair. "Mrs. Chen," Deborah started, then had to clear her throat to steady her voice. "You mentioned a literacy program looking for tutors?" Mrs. Chen looked up, her face brightening. Yes, the Community Literacy Center. They're expanding their program and need someone to coordinate tutoring. It would start as volunteer training, but there's a paid position opening up. Part-time coordinator. Her expression softened with something like understanding. Are you interested? Deborah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Mrs. Chen pulled out a business card from her pocket and handed it over. The director's name is Becca Hall. Tell her I sent you. That evening, Deborah sat in the guest room with the card in her hand, turning it over and over, the edges becoming soft from her nervous fingers. Part-time literacy coordinator. It probably paid nothing. Frank would mock it, call it her little hobby, use it as proof that she couldn't survive without him. But it was a beginning. It was hers. She filled out the online application on her laptop, hunched over the keyboard like she was doing something forbidden, which in a way she was. Frank had made it clear that he expected her to give up this independence nonsense and return to normal. Applying for a job without telling him felt like a small revolution. Education. Bachelor's in English Literature, Master's in Education. Employment history. 10 years as an elementary school teacher, ending 15 years ago when she'd left to support her husband's career and raise their daughter. The gap on her resume looked like a canyon, dark and unbridgeable. Who would want someone who'd been out of the workforce for 15 years? She filled in references from her old teaching days, former principals and colleagues who probably didn't even remember her. Then she stared at the submit button for a full 5 minutes before her finger finally pressed down. The confirmation email appeared immediately. Thank you for your application. We will review it and contact you if your qualifications match our needs. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was possibility, and that was more than she'd had in years. Frank found the confirmation email 2 days later. She'd forgotten to log out of her account, and he used her laptop sometimes when his was charging. She came home from the library to find him in the kitchen, arms crossed, his face the particular shade of red that meant he was controlling his anger, but barely. You applied for a job? Not a question, an accusation. Deborah set down her purse carefully, buying herself a moment to steady her breathing. Yes. Without telling me? I didn't realize I needed permission. His jaw tightened. This isn't about permission. It's about respect. About not making decisions that affect our family without discussion. Our family. As if he'd consulted her before bringing Michelle into their home. As if he'd discussed any of his decisions with her over the past 27 years. How does my working affect our family, Frank? He made a sound of frustration, like she was being deliberately obtuse. It reflects on me. What will people think? That I can't provide for. You? That my wife needs to work some poverty wage job because I'm not successful enough? There it was. Not concern for her well-being or their finances. Concern for his image, for how her choices reflected on him. This isn't about you, she said quietly. This is about me. About having something that's mine. Everything you have is yours. His gesture encompassed the house, the kitchen with its expensive appliances, the life he'd built around her like a very comfortable cage. I've given you everything. You've given me things, Frank. There's a difference. He stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. Then his expression hardened. Fine. Apply for your little job. See how far you get without my name behind you. See how it feels to work 40 hours a week for nothing. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've thrown away. He left the kitchen then, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Deborah stood alone in the immaculate space, surrounded by granite countertops and custom cabinets and all the beautiful, expensive things that had never been able to fill the hollow place inside her. Maybe I won't be, she whispered to the empty room. Maybe I won't throw anything away. Maybe I'll finally get something back. 3 days later, her phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Probably spam, probably nothing. But something made her press accept. Mrs. Edwards? This is Becca Hall from the Community Literacy Center. I received your application and I'd like to interview you for the coordinator position. Are you available Tuesday at 10? Deborah's hand trembled so badly she almost dropped the phone. Yes, I'm available. Wonderful. I'll send you the address. I look forward to meeting you. After she hung up, Deborah sat on the edge of her bed, the guest room bed that had become her refuge, and let herself feel it. Fear and excitement tangled together until she couldn't tell which was which. An interview. A real interview for a real job. She hadn't done this in 17 years. What if she'd forgotten how? What if she embarrassed herself? What if Frank was right and she was unemployable, too old, too rusty, too nothing? But underneath the fear was something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. She called Diana immediately. I have a job interview. Diana's shriek of joy came through the phone loud enough that Deborah had to pull it away from her ear. When? Tuesday. 10 o'clock. Di, I'm terrified. Good. Diana's voice was fierce. Being terrified means it matters. It means you're finally doing something that matters. That night, Deborah pulled her old teaching portfolio from a box in the basement, a cardboard box she'd packed 15 years ago and never opened. Inside were awards she'd won, letters from parents thanking her for her impact on their children, lesson plans she'd created, photos of her classroom with its bright bulletin boards and cozy reading corner. She'd forgotten this version of herself, the teacher who'd made learning an adventure. The young woman who'd believed she could change lives one student at a time. Looking at the photos, she barely recognized herself. So much younger, yes, but also lighter, unencumbered, full of possibility. What had happened to that woman? When had she traded possibility for security? When had she decided that being comfortable was more important than being alive? She tried on clothes from her closet, searching for something that said professional but not desperate. Most of her wardrobe was either too casual for an interview or too formal. The clothes she wore to Frank's business dinners, designed to make her look like the perfect corporate wife. She needed something in between, something that said, I'm competent and I remember who I am. She settled on a simple gray blazer over a white blouse, paired with black slacks. Not exciting, but appropriate. She tried it on and studied herself in the mirror. The blazer was a little loose. She'd lost weight from stress, but it would do. She looked tired, older than 52, but also determined. That would have to be enough. Sunday evening, Diana called. I'm coming. What? I'm flying in tomorrow. You need backup. Diana, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. You're about to do the bravest thing you've done in 27 years. I'm not missing it. Deborah felt tears sting her eyes. You don't have to. Stop saying that. Diana's voice was gentle but firm. Let someone help you for once. Let me help you. Diana arrived Monday afternoon, a whirlwind of energy and loyalty and the kind of fierce love that Deborah had forgotten existed. Frank was at work, so Diana settled into the guest room with Deborah, the two of them sitting cross-legged on the bed like college students again, drinking tea and talking until late into the night. Diana made her practice. Tell me about your teaching philosophy. Why do you want this job? What are your strengths? And every time Deborah started to apologize or minimize herself or speak in that careful, apologetic way she'd perfected over the years, Diana stopped her. No, try again. Pretend I'm a room full of 6-year-olds who need to believe in themselves. How do you talk to them? Deborah thought about her former students, the way she'd knelt beside their desks, looked them in the eyes, spoke to them with respect and belief, an unwavering conviction that they were capable of more than they knew. She'd never spoken to them the way Frank spoke to her. She'd never dismissed their questions or made them feel small or stupid for not knowing something. She'd built them up piece by piece until they believed in themselves. When had she stopped doing that for herself? She tried again, this time with the warmth and authority she'd once used in her classroom. My teaching philosophy is that every student deserves to be seen, to be valued, to know they matter. Learning isn't just about acquiring skills, It's about discovering your own capability, your own worth. When you help someone read, you're not just teaching them to decode words. You're giving them access to the world. You're telling them they belong in it. Diana grinned. That right there. That's who you are. Do that tomorrow. Tuesday morning arrived too quickly. Deborah woke at 5:30, her heart already racing. She went through her morning routine on autopilot. Shower, hair, makeup, the gray blazer outfit. Her hands shook so badly she had to redo her eyeliner 3 times. Downstairs, Frank was already in the kitchen. He looked up when she entered, took in her professional outfit, and his mouth tightened. "Today's your interview." "Yes." He poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate. "I need the car today. You'll have to reschedule." They only had one car. Frank's decision, made years ago under the guise of being financially sensible. He used it for work. She used it for groceries and errands and volunteer work. Except now he was taking it away on the one morning she absolutely needed it. "I have my interview at 10, she said carefully. "You knew that. My meeting is more important. Reschedule." The old Deborah would have folded, would have called Becca Hall and apologized and rescheduled, and somehow made it her fault that she'd inconvenienced everyone. The old Deborah would have spent the rest of the day feeling guilty about asking for what she needed. But something had shifted in the 3 days since she'd gotten the call. Some small seed of defiance had taken root. "No." Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm not rescheduling." Frank's head snapped up. "Excuse me? You heard me. This interview is important to me. I'm not rescheduling." Diana appeared in the doorway, dressed and ready, her car keys dangling from her finger. "I'll drive her." Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes were cold as she looked at Frank. Frank's face flushed. "This is between me and my wife. Your wife has a name. It's Deborah, and she's going to her interview." Diana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Have a great day at work, Frank." In the car, Deborah's hands wouldn't stop shaking. "I can't do this. Yes, you can. What if I'm terrible? What if I've forgotten everything? What if you're exactly what they're looking for?" Diana reached over and squeezed her hand. "What if this is the moment everything changes?" The Community Literacy Center was housed in a renovated brick building on the edge of downtown, sandwiched between a coffee shop and a used bookstore. It looked warm, welcoming, the kind of place that invited people in rather than intimidating them. Nothing like the cold professionalism of Frank's office tower with its marble lobby and security guards. Inside, the walls were painted in soft colors, sage green and warm cream. Bookshelves lined every available surface, overflowing with books in various languages. There were comfortable chairs scattered throughout, small tables with reading lamps, a children's corner with oversized pillows. It smelled like coffee and old paper and possibility. A woman emerged from an office at the back, mid-40s with natural gray streaking through her dark hair, wearing jeans and a cardigan. Her smile was genuine, reaching her eyes. "Deborah?" "Yes." Deborah's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm Becca Hall. Thanks for coming in." The handshake was firm, warm, confident. "Come on back." Becca's office was small but organized, with more books stacked on every surface and a window that let in morning light. She gestured to a chair across from her desk and settled into her own seat with the ease of someone completely comfortable in her space. The interview started formally. Credentials, experience, availability. Deborah answered carefully, aware of the 15-year gap in her employment history, trying not to sound apologetic about it, but not quite succeeding. Becca nodded, taking notes, asking follow-up questions that were thoughtful rather than judgmental. Then Becca set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. "Tell me why you want this job. After 15 years away from the field, why now?" Deborah's prepared answer evaporated. She'd practiced something professional and measured, something about wanting to give back to the community and use her skills in a meaningful way. But looking at Becca's open, interested expression, sitting in this warm space that felt like everything her house didn't, the truth came out instead. because I forgot who I was. Her voice cracked slightly. I spent 27 years making myself smaller, making myself useful instead of meaningful. I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's perfect accessory. And somewhere in all that, I lost myself completely. Becca didn't interrupt, just listened with the kind of attention that made Deborah feel truly heard for the first time in years. But when I'm at the library, when I'm helping someone learn to read, helping them find their voice, she stopped, realized what she'd said, felt her cheeks flush. I'm describing what I need for myself, aren't I? A quiet moment passed. Then Becca smiled, not with pity, but with recognition. Every person who works here is here because they remember what it's like to feel voiceless. I left a marriage 15 years ago. She said it simply, matter-of-factly. My husband told me I'd never make it without him, that I was nothing without his support. She gestured around the office to the center beyond. I built this, from nothing, applied for grants, recruited volunteers, found space, created programs. Every person who walks through that door and learns to read, learns to speak English, learns to believe in their own capability. That's proof he was wrong about me. Becca met Deborah's eyes. I've been waiting for someone who still remembers why this work matters. Someone who understands that teaching literacy isn't just about skills. It's about telling people they deserve to take up space in the world. She slid a paper across the desk. That's the job description and salary. Information. It's not much. $32,000 a year for 25 hours a week. But it's yours if you want it. Deborah stared at the paper, at the words employment contract at the top, at her own name typed in the blank space. Just like that? Just like that. Becca's smile was warm. You start next Monday. Bring your ideas, your passion, and your story. We need all three. Deborah picked up the pen with trembling hands. The salary was less than Frank spent on golf club dues. It was less than they'd spent on landscaping last month. It was nothing compared to the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. It was everything. She signed her name, Deborah Edwards, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. The first small step toward it. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. You have no idea what this means. Becca's expression softened. Actually, I think I do. In the parking lot, Diana was waiting in the car. Deborah opened the door and just held up the signed contract, unable to speak past the tears. Diana screamed. Actually screamed loud enough that people in the coffee shop next door looked out the window. She jumped out of the car and hugged Deborah so hard they both nearly fell over. I'm so proud of you. I'm so damn proud of you. They sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, crying and laughing and celebrating. Diana insisted on taking Deborah to lunch. Not somewhere fancy, just a little cafe with good sandwiches and better coffee. They ordered too much food, got dessert, even though they were both full, toasted with iced tea because neither of them wanted wine before 3 o'clock. A woman at the next table overheard them celebrating, the word job interview floating across the space. She turned and raised her water glass. Congratulations on your new job. Thank you, Deborah said, and realized she was smiling. Really, genuinely smiling in a way she hadn't in years. I start Monday. The woman's smile was warm. Good for you. It's never too late to start over. After lunch, they drove home slowly, taking the long way, neither of them ready to face Frank yet. Diana had a flight that evening. She'd taken 2 days off work just to be here for the interview, and Deborah felt her stomach tighten at the thought of being alone again. You're going to be okay, Diana said, reading her mind the way she always had. You did the hardest part. You said yes to yourself. At home, Frank's car was already in the driveway. Of course. He'd probably left work early specifically to be there when she returned, to ask how it went, to tell her she'd embarrassed herself. Deborah walked in with the signed contract in her hand and Diana at her side. Frank was in the living room, reading on his tablet, his posture screaming casual indifference, even though they both knew he'd been waiting. Well? He didn't look up. Did you embarrass yourself? I got the job. She said it simply, not giving him the satisfaction of her excitement or her fear. Now he looked up, his expression carefully arranged into something dismissive. Of course they hired you. They probably pay minimum wage and can't find anyone else willing to work for nothing. Diana made a sound in her throat, something between disgust and warning, but Deborah put a hand on her friend's arm. It's okay. To Frank, she said, you're right. It's not much money, $32,000 a year for 25 hours a week. Nothing compared to what you make. His mouth curved into something like a smile, vindicated. But it's my money, my work, my choice. She held up the contract, and for the first time in 15 years, I have something that belongs to me. Frank's expression darkened. This is ridiculous. You're acting like a teenager. I'm acting like someone who has options. She felt surprisingly calm, surprisingly steady. Get used to it. She walked past him to the stairs, Diana following close behind. Behind them, she heard Frank mutter something about a midlife crisis, about how she'd come to her senses eventually, about how this phase would pass. Maybe it would. Maybe she'd wake up tomorrow and be terrified again, convinced she'd made a mistake, ready to crawl back into the comfortable cage of her marriage. But today, right now, in this moment, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt alive. That night, after Diana left for the airport with promises to call every day, after Frank had gone to bed without speaking to her, Deborah sat in the guest room and pulled out the employment contract. She read it again, running her finger over her signature, over the words, Literacy Coordinator, over the start date that was now just 6 days away, $32,000 a year, paid twice monthly, direct deposit to an account of her choosing. She realized she'd need her own bank account. Everything was currently joint or in Frank's name. The checking account she had access to was technically his. He just added her name years ago so she could buy groceries and household items. He could close it any time. Probably would close it once he realized she was serious about leaving. Tomorrow, she'd go to a different bank, open an account in her name only, set up direct deposit. It would take most of her first paycheck just to afford a security deposit on an apartment eventually, but it was a start. It was hers. She pulled out her phone and texted Diana, "Thank you for coming. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Diana's response came immediately. "You've always been strong enough. You just forgot for a while. Love you, brave woman. Brave." Deborah turned the word over in her mind. She didn't feel brave. She felt terrified, exhausted, overwhelmed. But maybe brave wasn't about not being scared. Maybe it was about doing the hard thing even when you were shaking. Monday morning, 6 days. 6 days until she started her new job, her new life, her new self. 6 days until she became something other than Frank's wife. 6 days until she became Deborah again. She could do this. She would do this. Because the alternative, going back to being invisible, voiceless, erased, was worse than any fear she carried about moving forward. The champagne glass had shattered, and she couldn't put it back together. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some things needed to break before they could become something new. Maybe she needed to shatter completely before she could rebuild herself into something authentic. In the darkness of the guest room, Deborah closed her eyes and imagined her first day of work. Walking into the literacy center, not as a volunteer, but as staff. Having a desk, a schedule, responsibilities that mattered. Being valued for her mind, her skills, her contributions. Being seen. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep not with dread for tomorrow, but with something dangerously close to hope. Chapter 3. The first month at the Community Literacy Center passed in a blur of learning and growing and remembering who she'd been before she became Frank's wife. Deborah thrived in ways that surprised even herself. The work came back to her naturally, the patience required to help struggling readers, the creativity to find different approaches when one method didn't work, the organizational skills to coordinate schedules and curricula and grant applications, Becca noticed. By week 3, she'd increased Deborah's hours. By week 4, she'd given her a key to the building and made her assistant director. The title came with a small raise. Not much, but enough that Deborah could afford the car payment on the used Honda Civic she'd bought with her first paycheck. Her own car, reliable, practical, paid for with money she'd earned. She'd cried when she drove it off the lot. She'd opened a bank account at a different institution than Frank used, one across town where no one knew her as Mrs. Edwards. The teller had treated her like any other customer, not dismissively, not condescendingly, just professionally. Deborah Edwards. Not Frank's wife, just Deborah. It felt revolutionary. Her paychecks deposited automatically. She watched the balance grow slowly. $500, then $1,000, then $1,500. Not enough to move out yet, but enough to know she could eventually. Enough to feel the first tremors of financial independence she hadn't experienced since she was 25. The students she worked with became more than just names on a schedule. There was Rosa, 58 years old, learning to read after a lifetime of hiding her illiteracy from everyone, including her own children. There was Marcus, 42, preparing for his GED so he could get a better job and support his family. There was Yolanda, 33, an immigrant working 2 jobs and still showing up twice a week to improve her English because she refused to let her circumstances define her possibilities. Each of them was starting over. Each of them was choosing courage over comfort. Each of them reminded Deborah of herself, scared, determined, refusing to accept that it was too late to become something more. But the contrast between her 2 lives became increasingly unbearable. Morning to mid-afternoon, she was competent, valued, purposeful. She made decisions that mattered. She solved problems. People listened when she spoke. Becca asked for her opinion and actually implemented her suggestions. The students looked at her with respect and gratitude. Then she'd drive home, in her own car now, which gave her a small thrill every time, and return to the house where Frank treated her like an irritating houseguest who'd overstayed her welcome. He'd escalated his campaign of silent treatment mixed with strategic cruelty. He didn't speak to her except when necessary. He made plans without consulting her. He told people, neighbors, his mother, their mutual acquaintances, that Deborah was going through something, that she was having a midlife crisis, that she was acting erratic due to menopause. He was controlling the narrative before she could tell her own story. She started noticing other things too. The way he'd show up at the literacy center during her shift, claiming he was just in the neighborhood, just checking on her. The way he'd call repeatedly during work hours, getting angry when she didn't answer immediately because she was teaching. The way he'd ask pointed questions about where she'd been, who she'd talked to, what she'd done, as if she owed him a detailed accounting of every moment. It was suffocating. But it was also illuminating. Because now that she had something of her own, something he couldn't control, she could see how much he'd controlled everything else, how carefully he'd built a life where she was entirely dependent on him, for money, for housing, for social connection, for her very sense of self. 2 months into her new job, on a Tuesday afternoon when she came home early because the center was closed for repairs, she heard Frank's voice coming from his home office. The door was slightly ajar. She wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have listened, except she heard her own name. "I'm telling you, she's unstable." Frank's voice was measured, professional. She'd heard him use that tone with business clients. It's gotten worse lately. Erratic behavior, irrational decisions. I'm concerned about her mental health. Deborah froze in the hallway, her bag still hanging from her shoulder. "I understand," Frank continued. "But if she tries to leave, if she starts making trouble, everyone needs to know that she's not in her right mind, that this isn't about me, it's about her having some kind of breakdown." He was laying groundwork, creating a story, making sure that if she divorced him, everyone would believe she was crazy, that he was the victim of a mentally unstable wife rather than the architect of her erasure. Her hands shook. Her breath came short and fast, but underneath the panic was something else. Clarity. This was who he was. Not the man she'd married 27 years ago, if that man had ever really existed. This was who he'd always been, and she'd just been too busy accommodating him to see it. She backed away from the office quietly, went upstairs to the guest room, her room now, and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and forced herself to breathe slowly, deeply, until her hands stopped shaking enough to pull out her phone. She texted Olive, "Can you come home? I need to talk to you." Her daughter's response came within minutes. "On my way. There tonight." Then she called Diana. "I heard him on the phone. He's telling people I'm mentally unstable, building a case that I'm having a breakdown so no one will believe me if I leave." Diana's response was immediate and fierce. "Then you leave before he can finish building that case. You document everything, you get a lawyer, and you file for divorce. Now, Deb, you do it now. I don't have enough money saved yet. Then you stay somewhere else until you do. You can't stay in that house with him. It's not safe. He hasn't hurt me, not physically. There are lots of ways to hurt someone." Diana's voice gentled. "Deb, listen to me. You've come so far. Don't let him convince you that you're crazy for wanting to be treated with basic respect." After they hung up, Deborah sat in the silence of the guest room and let herself feel the full weight of the truth. She'd spent 27 years with a man who saw her as property rather than partner, who valued her utility but not her personhood, who would destroy her reputation rather than admit he'd treated her badly. She'd thought the affair was the problem, but the affair was just a symptom. The real problem was that she'd chosen comfort over authenticity so many years ago that she'd forgotten there was a choice at all. Frank came home at 7. She heard him moving around downstairs, heard him call up, "Deborah, where's dinner?" She didn't answer. For the first time, she just didn't answer. He appeared in the doorway of the guest room minutes later. "Did you hear me?" "Yes." "Then why?" "Because I'm not cooking for you anymore." Her voice was calm, steady. "I'm not cleaning for you. I'm not performing the role of your wife. It's over, Frank." His face cycled through emotions, surprise, anger, something that might have been fear. "You're being ridiculous. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between them. She'd thought saying them would be terrifying, but instead it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 27 years. Frank's expression hardened. "Fine, divorce me. But you'll leave with nothing. This house is mine. The accounts are mine. You'll have your little job that pays nothing, and that's all you'll have. Then that's what I'll have." He stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "You're bluffing." "I'm not. Think about Olive. Think about what you're teaching her. That marriage is disposable. That commitment means nothing. I'm teaching her that she deserves to be respected. That's more than you ever taught her." His face flushed red. "I've given you everything. You've given me things. You've never given me respect." Frank's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "You'll regret this." "Maybe. But I'll regret staying more." He left the doorway then, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. She heard the front door slam, his car starting. The sound of him leaving, probably to Michelle's place, probably to complain about his crazy wife who didn't appreciate anything. Deborah sat in the quiet that followed and felt something settle into place. Terror, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely. But also relief. She'd said it out loud. She'd drawn the line. There was no going back now, and that was somehow freeing. Olive arrived at 9:30, letting herself in with her key. She found Deborah in the guest room, sitting in the dark. "Mom?" Deborah turned on the bedside lamp. "Hey, sweetheart." Olive took in the scene. Her mother in the guest room, the absence of her father, the tension thick enough to feel. "What happened?" "I told your father I want a divorce." Olive's face transformed. She'd been braced for bad news, but this made her eyes fill with tears even as she smiled. Finally. "Oh, Mom, finally. You're not upset?" "Upset?" Olive sat on the bed beside her mother and took her hand. "I've been waiting for this since I was 16 years old. I've watched him diminish you, dismiss you, treat you like you were invisible. I couldn't stand it. That's why I stopped coming home." The confession hit Deborah like a physical blow. "You stayed away because of me? Because of how he treated you? Because watching it and not being able to stop it was too painful?" Olive wiped her eyes. "Mom, you're amazing. You're smart and kind and capable, and he's spent 27 years making you forget that. I'm not sad you're leaving him. I'm just sad it took this long." They held each other while Deborah cried, not sad tears, but release. Relief. The vindication of knowing her daughter saw her, valued her, was proud of her for finally choosing herself. "Where are you going to stay?" Olive asked eventually. "I don't know yet. I don't have enough saved for an apartment. Stay with me. My place is tiny, but we'll make it work." Deborah was tempted, but something stopped her. "Thank you, sweetheart, but I need to do this myself. I need to know I can." Olive understood. "Okay, but I'm here if you need me. Always." After Olive left, Deborah called Becca. It was late, almost 11, but Becca had told her to call any time. "I left him," or "I'm leaving him. I told him I want a divorce." Becca didn't hesitate. "Pack a bag, come here. I have a guest room. I can't impose—" "You're not imposing. You're accepting help. There's a difference. Pack your essentials. I'll be up when you get here." If Deborah's courage is inspiring you, hit that like button and drop a comment sharing your own moment of choosing yourself. Your story matters. Deborah packed quickly. Clothes, toiletries, her laptop, the employment contract she'd signed like it was a sacred document. She took photos of herself in the mirror, documenting that she had no bruises, no injuries, evidence that she was leaving by choice, not force. She gathered copies of financial documents she could find, bank statements, credit card bills, anything that showed the pattern of his control. She left her wedding ring on the bathroom counter. Then she walked out of the house she'd lived in for 23 years with a single suitcase and her purse, got into her own car, and drove to Becca's house on the other side of town. Becca was waiting at the door when she arrived, wrapped in a cardigan and concern. She didn't ask questions, just pulled Deborah into a hug and showed her to the guest room, small but warm, with soft blankets and a lamp that cast gentle light. Everything the master bedroom in Frank's house wasn't. "Get some sleep," Becca said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps." But Deborah couldn't sleep. She lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and felt the full weight of what she'd done. She'd left. Actually left. She had maybe $3,000 in savings, a part-time job, and nowhere permanent to live. Frank would fight her in court. Would probably win. Would make sure she came away with as little as possible. She'd given up security, comfort, the life everyone envied. For what? The abstract concept of dignity? The vague promise of someday feeling whole? What if she'd made a terrible mistake? The next morning, Becca found her in the kitchen at 5:30, already dressed, staring at coffee she hadn't drunk. "You okay?" Deborah tried to smile. "Just thinking, second-guessing, third and fourth-guessing." Becca poured her own coffee and sat across from Deborah at the small kitchen table. "Want to hear my story?" Deborah nodded. 15 years ago, I was married to a man who controlled everything. What I wore, who I talked to, how I spent my time. He didn't hit me, so I told myself it wasn't abuse. He just wanted what was best for me. That's what he said, anyway. Becca wrapped her hands around her mug. When I finally left, I had $800 and a friend's couch. No job, no prospects, no idea what I was doing. What happened? I built this. She gestured around them, to the center she'd created. I proved to myself that I didn't need him to survive, that I'd been strong all along. I just needed to believe it. She met Deborah's eyes. The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was believing I was worth the fight. But here's what I learned. You don't find your worth. You stop letting anyone take it. Becca stood, pulled a book from her shelf, and handed it to Deborah. Wild by Cheryl Strayed, for when you need to remember you're capable of hard things. The first week living at Becca's passed in a surreal haze. Deborah went to work, came home to a house that wasn't hers, ate dinners someone else cooked. Becca treated her like a guest, but also like a friend, giving her space, but also checking in, asking how she was, making sure she wasn't drowning in doubt. Frank called repeatedly, left voicemails that cycled between anger and manipulation. Come home. We can work this out. You're throwing away everything we built. Think about Olive. Think about what you're teaching her. You're being selfish. You're being cruel. You're going to regret this. She didn't call him back. His mother did call, though. Judith showed up at the Literacy Center during Deborah's Tuesday shift, perfectly coiffed and carrying judgment like a designer handbag. Deborah, this has gone far enough. Hello, Judith. Frank tells me you've moved out, that you've told him you want a divorce. Her tone suggested this was both unthinkable and Deborah's fault. What has gotten into you? Nothing's gotten into me. I'm just finally listening to what's been there all along. Every marriage has rough patches, dear. That's what forgiveness is for. I've been forgiving him for 27 years. He's never once apologized. Men make mistakes. They can't help it sometimes. It's our job as wives to keep the family together. Judith said it so matter-of-factly, as if women being responsible for men's behavior was just natural law. Did you keep your family together? Deborah heard herself ask. Were you happy, Judith? In 43 years of marriage, were you ever actually happy? Judith's face paled. Happiness isn't the point. Commitment is. Duty is. The Edwards family doesn't give up when things get hard. Maybe that's the problem. After Judith left, Deborah sat in her office. Yes, she had an office now, small but hers, and felt the pressure of everyone's expectations. Frank's mother wanting her to stay in her place, Frank's business associates watching to see what she'd do, the neighbors who'd whisper about the failed marriage, even well-meaning friends suggesting maybe counseling, maybe giving it another try, maybe not throwing away nearly 3 decades over one mistake. One mistake. As if the affair was the only problem, as if the years of dismissiveness and control and erasure counted for nothing. She started seeing a lawyer, one who did a free initial consultation. The news was sobering. The house was in Frank's name. Most of the investments were his. She was entitled to spousal support and a portion of marital assets. But Frank had expensive lawyers and would fight for every dollar. It would be expensive, lengthy, ugly, and she might not get much at the end of it. Can I win? Deborah asked. Depends on what winning means to you. The lawyer looked at her steadily. If winning means getting half of everything, probably not. If winning means getting out with your dignity and enough to start over, yes, absolutely yes. Her new salary barely covered her expenses. Car payment, insurance, phone bill, money for groceries at Becca's. She was saving nothing, going backward financially, living in someone else's guest room at 52 years old with no clear path to independent housing. Frank's lawyer sent settlement offers, low ones. Take $30,000 and walk away. Take $50,000 and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Take $75,000 and agree the divorce was mutual, no fault, and never speak publicly about the marriage. Her lawyer said each offer was insulting given the length of the marriage and the assets involved. But also, it was money. Real money. Money that could get her an apartment, furniture, stability. Late one night, lying in Becca's guest room, Deborah drafted an email to Frank's lawyer. I accept the settlement terms. Her cursor hovered over send. $75,000 would change everything. She could move out, stop imposing on Becca, have a cushion while she figured out her next steps. All she had to do was sign the non-disclosure agreement, agree to never tell anyone why the marriage ended, let Frank control the narrative forever, let everyone believe whatever he wanted them to believe about her. Her finger moved toward the send button. Then she remembered Rosa, her student who was learning to read at 58, who'd told Deborah just yesterday, "My husband said I was too stupid to learn," Every time I read a new word, I prove him wrong. Deborah closed the draft email without sending it. She couldn't take Frank's money in exchange for silence, because silence had nearly killed her. Silence had let her disappear piece by piece until she barely existed. How could she choose it again, even if it came with $75,000? But God, she was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of being brave. Tired of people asking, "Are you sure?" and suggesting counseling and implying she was throwing away a good thing. Tired of the financial pressure, the uncertainty, the fear that she'd made a devastating mistake. 2 months after moving out, exhausted and scared and drowning in doubt, Deborah showed up for Rosa's tutoring session. Rosa struggled through a paragraph, got frustrated, threw down her pencil. "I'm too old for this. Too stupid. Why am I even trying?" The words echoed something Frank had said 1,000 times in 1,000 ways. Deborah reached across the table and took Rosa's hand. "You are neither old nor stupid. You're brave. Do you know how much courage it takes to start over? To look at your life and say, 'I deserve more than this,' and actually do something about it?" Rosa looked at her, really looked at her. "You're talking about yourself, aren't you?" Deborah felt tears sting her eyes. "Maybe I am." Rosa squeezed her hand. "My daughter told me about your situation. She said you left your husband." Her voice was gentle, knowing. "My husband told me I was stupid every day for 30 years. I believed him. But if I can learn to read at 58, you can learn to stand up at 52. She picked up the paragraph again, started over. When she read it successfully from beginning to end, they both cried. Rosa said, "We're doing it, aren't we? We're both learning." "Yes." Deborah smiled through tears. "We're both starting over." That night, she pulled up the draft email one more time, looked at the acceptance, the surrender, the path of least resistance. Then she deleted it. She called her lawyer instead. "I'm not settling. I'm going to court." The lawyer warned her. "This will get uglier before it gets better. It's already ugly. At least this way. It's honest." She hung up and sat in the darkness of Becca's guest room. Smaller than her walk-in closet had been, furnished with borrowed items, temporary in every way. But the door locked from the inside. She was safe here, free here, herself here. She had no money, no security, no guarantee this would work out. But she had something she'd lost 27 years ago. She had her voice, and she wasn't giving it back. Not for $75,000. Not for anyone. Chapter 4. The weeks leading up to trial were brutal. Frank's lawyer subpoenaed everyone. Diana, Olive, the book club ladies, even Mrs. Chen from the library. His strategy was clear. Paint Deborah as unstable, vindictive, a woman having a breakdown who'd abandoned her family responsibilities. Build a case that she was the problem, not him. The depositions were invasive and humiliating. Deborah sat in a sterile conference room while Frank's attorney asked questions designed to make her look irrational. "Isn't it true you left without warning? Isn't it true you refused marriage counseling? Isn't it true you have a history of anxiety and depression?" Each question crafted to suggest she was mentally unwell, that her decision to leave wasn't rational but symptomatic. Diana's deposition was different. Frank's attorney had clearly expected a sympathetic friend who'd admit Deborah was struggling, acting strangely, not herself. Instead, Diana came in prepared and furious. "Has Mrs. Edwards seemed unstable to you?" "No, she's seemed clear-headed for the first time in 20 years. The attorney tried another angle. "Isn't it true she's been withdrawn from friends lately? Withdrawn or finally honest?" Diana's voice was sharp. "For years, Deborah told me everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Now she's telling the truth. That's not instability, that's courage." Olive's deposition was even more powerful. She provided specific examples of her father's dismissiveness, his need to control, his pattern of making Deborah feel small. When Frank's attorney suggested she was just taking her mother's side, Olive looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'm taking the truth side. There's a difference." But Frank had his own witnesses. His mother testified that Deborah had always been emotional, prone to dramatics, difficult to please. Business associates spoke to Frank's character: hardworking, generous, a family man. His therapist provided a professional evaluation suggesting Deborah exhibited signs of a midlife crisis and possible personality disorder. Michelle even testified. Brief, uncomfortable, but damaging. She claimed the affair had been brief, that Frank had tried to end it, that Mrs. Edwards had overreacted and refused to listen to reason. She made it sound like Deborah was the unreasonable one, like the betrayal was minor and the reaction disproportionate. Through it all, Deborah kept working, kept showing up at the literacy center, kept teaching Rosa and Marcus and Yolanda, kept doing the one thing that reminded her she was competent, valuable, capable of more than Frank had led her believe. But the stress was destroying her. She lost more weight she couldn't afford to lose, woke up at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning, mind racing through worst-case scenarios, had panic attacks in parking lots, her chest so tight she thought she was dying. Went to the emergency room once, convinced she was having a heart attack, only to be told it was anxiety. The medical bill was $3,000. Money she didn't have. The doctor had looked at her with concern and said, "Your body is telling you something. You need to reduce stress." She'd almost laughed. Reduce stress, as if she could simply choose not to be terrified of losing everything. 1 week before trial, Frank's lawyer made a final offer: $250,000, spousal support for 5 years, one condition: sign a non-disclosure agreement, agree to mutual no-fault divorce, never speak publicly about the marriage or the reasons it ended. Deborah's attorney called her with the news. "This is a good offer. Better than we might get at trial. You should seriously consider it." That night, Deborah sat at Becca's kitchen table with the offer printed out in front of her. $250,000. She could get an apartment, furnish it, have a cushion while she figured out her future. She could stop fighting. Stop being the difficult woman, the one making trouble, the one refusing to be reasonable. Everyone wanted her to take it. Her attorney, because it was practical. Judith, because it would end the embarrassment. Even some of her friends from the book club who'd reached out privately. "Just take the money, Deborah. You've made your point. Move on." But the NDA, the silence. The agreement that what happened in her marriage would stay private, that she'd let Frank control the narrative, that she'd accept money in exchange for never telling the truth. She thought about the woman who'd cleaned up broken glass on command, the woman who'd apologized for existing, the woman who'd shrunk herself so small she'd nearly disappeared. Could she take $250,000 and become that woman again, even partially? Even just the part that stayed quiet, that caused no trouble, that made everyone comfortable? Becca came home from a late meeting and found Deborah still sitting there, the offer in front of her, untouched dinner growing cold. "Have you decided?" "I don't know what to do." Becca sat down across from her. "What does your gut tell you? That I can't buy my silence back after finally finding my voice?" Deborah's eyes filled with tears. "But I'm so tired, Becca. I'm so tired of fighting, and $250,000 is life-changing money." "It is," Becca agreed. "But would you be able to live with yourself?" That was the question, wasn't it? Could she take Frank's money and live with the knowledge that she'd once again chosen comfort over truth? That she'd agreed, legally, bindingly, to let his version of their marriage be the only version anyone ever knew? The next morning, a Saturday, Deborah went for a drive. She found herself at a park near where she and Frank had lived, a place she used to take Olive as a child. She sat on a bench and watched parents with their children, couples walking dogs, people living their ordinary lives while her entire world hung in balance. Her phone rang. Frank. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press accept. "Did you get the offer?" His voice was careful, controlled. "Yes, it's generous. More than generous." He paused. "Take it, Deborah. Let's both move on. With me never allowed to tell anyone why I left you, The alternative is going to court where I will destroy you." His voice hardened. "I have better lawyers, better resources. You'll come out with nothing and everyone will know you're unstable. Is that what you want? What I want is for you to acknowledge what you did, to admit you treated me badly." He laughed. "That's not happening. Take the money or don't. But don't pretend this is about principle. You're just being vindictive." She hung up. That afternoon, Frank showed up at Becca's house. Deborah was in the small backyard reading the Cheryl Strayed book Becca had given her when she heard the doorbell. Becca answered, and Deborah heard raised voices. She came around to the front to find Frank on the doorstep, Becca blocking the door. "I need to talk to my wife. Ex-wife soon, and she doesn't want to talk to you." Becca's voice was firm. "Deborah, please." Frank's voice took on a pleading tone she'd never heard before. "Be reasonable. $250,000. That's more than you could get at trial. I'm trying to do right by you." Deborah stepped forward, stood beside Becca. "Do right by me now when I'm leaving? Where was doing right by me for the past 27 years? I gave you a good life. You gave me things. Things aren't the same as respect. Things aren't the same as being valued. Things aren't the same as being seen." His face flushed. "Fine. Go to court. Lose everything. But don't say I didn't try." Olive had arrived during this exchange, pulling into the driveway just in time to hear her father's words. She got out of her car, walked straight to Frank. "You need to leave." "Olive, I'm your father." "You're a bully. You've always been a bully. Mom's going to court, she's going to tell the truth, and I'm going to be there to support her. Now get off this property." Frank looked between his daughter and his wife, both standing against him, united in a way they'd never been while living under his roof. His expression cycled through anger and disbelief before settling on something cold. "You'll regret this, both of you." He left. Olive hugged Deborah. "Don't you dare settle. Don't you dare let him win." That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, Deborah thought about everything she'd lost. The house, the financial security, the comfortable life, friends who'd chosen Frank's version of events over hers. She'd lost the identity she'd carried for 27 years, the role she'd perfected, the performance she could do in her sleep. But what had she gained? Herself, her voice, her daughter's respect, the knowledge that she could survive hard things, that she was employable, capable, stronger than she'd believed. Was that worth more than $250,000? Her heart said yes. Her bank account said she was insane. At 2 a.m, she called Diana. "Did I wake you?" "Always." "What's wrong?" "I can't take his money, Di. I can't sign away the truth. But everyone thinks I'm being stupid, that I'm throwing away financial security for nothing. It's not nothing." Diana's voice was soft but certain. "It's your integrity. Your story, your truth. Those things have value even if you can't deposit them in a bank. What if I lose at trial? What if I end up with nothing? Then you'll have nothing except your self-respect. And that's still more than you had when you were cleaning up broken glass." Monday morning, Deborah called her attorney. "I'm not settling. I'm going to court. Are you sure?" The lawyer's voice held warning and respect in equal measure. "Yes, I'm sure." "Okay then. Let's prepare your testimony." The week before trial was surreal. Deborah kept working, kept teaching, kept living in Becca's guest room while preparing to stand in front of a judge and explain why her marriage had ended. Her attorney prepped her with practice questions, teaching her to stay calm, to answer clearly, to not let Frank's lawyer rattle her. Diana flew in the day before trial, declared she was staying until it was over, consequences at her own job be damned. "Your family," she told Deborah, and family shows up. Trial day arrived with terrible inevitability. Deborah woke at 5, couldn't eat breakfast, changed clothes 3 times. She'd borrowed a suit from Becca, professional but not expensive, appropriate for someone whose husband controlled all the money. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who was terrified, but standing anyway. At the courthouse, Frank was already there with his legal team. 3 lawyers in expensive suits, looking confident and well-rested. He'd brought witnesses, his mother, 2 business associates, a character witness. On Deborah's side, her single attorney, Diana, Olive, and Becca, who'd taken the morning off work. The optics were clear. He looked powerful, supported, successful. She looked small, barely holding on, barely getting by. The trial began. Frank's attorney went first, painting a picture of a devoted husband and successful provider. Mr. Edwards worked tirelessly to provide an enviable lifestyle, beautiful home, financial security, everything a woman could want. This is a case of a middle-aged woman having a crisis, making impulsive decisions, abandoning her responsibilities. His character witnesses testified to Frank's generosity, his dedication, his status in the community. Judith took the stand and described Deborah as always emotional, prone to dramatics, never quite satisfied. Michelle's testimony was brief but effective. She framed the affair as a brief lapse during a stressful time, something Frank had tried to end, something Mrs. Edwards had blown out of proportion. Then Deborah's attorney presented her case. She started with financial records showing Frank's control, all accounts in his name, Deborah given an allowance like a child, no access to information about their assets, text messages showing his dismissiveness. Don't be dramatic. You're overthinking. Can't you just be happy with what you have? Diana testified about watching Deborah disappear over the years, about the friend who'd edited herself into near silence. Olive provided examples of her father's need to control, to dismiss, to make her mother feel incompetent. But the strongest testimony would be Deborah's own. When they called her to the stand, Deborah's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. She was sworn in, sat down, faced the judge and the courtroom full of people watching her most painful private moments become public record. Frank's attorney approached for cross-examination first. His strategy was clear: make her look unstable, vindictive, irrational. Mrs. Edwards, isn't it true you haven't worked in 15 years? I left my career to support my husband and raise our daughter. Yes. And isn't it true you enjoyed the lifestyle my client provided? I had a comfortable life materially. Yes. The attorney produced documents. Isn't it true you've been diagnosed with anxiety and depression? Years ago. After my mother died, I sought therapy and worked through it. So you have a history of mental health issues? I have a history of seeking help when I needed it. That's called being healthy, not unstable. The attorney changed tactics. If the marriage was so terrible, why did you stay 27 years? The question hung in the air, designed to trap her, to make her look complicit or crazy. Deborah took a breath and told the truth, because he was right. The attorney looked confused. Excuse me? He told me I was nothing without him, and I believed it. She met Frank's eyes across the courtroom. For 27 years, I believed it. She continued, her voice gaining strength. I stayed because I was terrified, because every time I had a thought, an opinion, a feeling that differed from his, he dismissed it. Over 27 years, I learned that my voice didn't matter, that I didn't matter except for what I could provide, a well-run home, a good image, compliance. The affair wasn't the problem, was it? The affair was proof of what I'd known all along. He didn't respect me. He didn't see me. He didn't value me as a person, only as a function. She pulled out copies of financial records. I had no access to our accounts. I didn't know how much money we had. I couldn't make purchases over $50 without permission. When I asked to see our finances, he refused, said it wasn't my business. A partnership where one person has all the power isn't a marriage. It's ownership. The attorney tried to interrupt, but Deborah kept going. And I'm to blame for one thing: staying too long. For believing the lie that I was lucky, that I should be grateful, that asking for basic respect was asking for too much. Frank's attorney tried to paint the settlement offer as generous. Mrs. Edwards, you were offered $250,000. That's a substantial amount. Why did you refuse? Because it came with a condition. I had to agree never to speak about why the marriage ended. Her voice was steady now, clear. He wanted to pay me to stay silent, to let everyone believe I left for no reason, that I was unstable, that I was the problem. And you couldn't do that? I'd rather have nothing and the truth than everything and a lie. The attorney tried a few more angles, but Deborah didn't break. She answered every question honestly, calmly, without the dramatics they'd tried to paint her with. Then her own attorney asked questions that let her tell her story, about the champagne glass shattering, about Michelle laughing, about Frank's command to clean it up, about the moment she'd realized she'd been cleaning up his messes, literal and metaphorical, for 27 years. When she described the charity gala where she'd overheard Frank calling her unstable, laying groundwork to discredit her before she could leave, several women in the gallery nodded. They recognized the tactic. Deborah spoke about her teaching job, about remembering she was competent and capable, about students like Rosa who were learning it's never too late to start over, about choosing truth over comfort, dignity over security. She was on the stand for 3 hours. By the end, she was exhausted but also lighter. She'd told the truth, all of it, in a public forum, under oath, for the official record. Frank couldn't control this narrative, couldn't edit her words, couldn't silence her. When she stepped down, Olive was crying. Diana, too. Even Becca had tears in her eyes. Frank's final rebuttal was weak. His attorney tried to paint Deborah as vindictive, as someone refusing a generous settlement out of spite. But the damage was done. The judge had heard Deborah's testimony, seen the financial records, listened to the pattern of control and dismissal. Before the judge retired to deliberate, Frank's attorney approached with one last offer. $300,000, no NDA, just take the money and walk away. Deborah looked at Frank sitting across the courtroom, saw the uncertainty in his face, the realization that he might not win this, that his money and lawyers might not be enough. She looked at her attorney. No, Mrs. Edwards, that's a substantial— I said no. She stood, faced Frank directly. I'm not here for money. I'm here to make sure the record is clear. I'm not the problem. I never was. The judge returned after a 2-hour recess. Everyone rose as she entered, then sat in heavy silence as she reviewed her notes. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony presented. The judge's voice was measured, professional. This court finds that Mrs. Edwards is entitled to equitable distribution of marital assets. While the house was purchased before the marriage, all other assets accumulated during the 27-year marriage are subject to division. Furthermore, Mr. Edwards maintained exclusive control of finances throughout the marriage, which this court finds constitutes economic abuse. Mrs. Edwards made substantial non-financial contributions to the marriage and Mr. Edwards's career success through homemaking, child-rearing, and social support. The judge outlined the settlement. 40% of all marital assets, spousal support for 7 years, and, crucially, no gag order. Deborah was free to tell her story. It wasn't half, it was less than half. But it was validation, legal, official validation that she'd been mistreated, that her reasons for leaving were legitimate, that she wasn't crazy or vindictive or unstable. She'd won. Not the money, though there was enough to start over. She'd won her truth. Frank's face was red, his jaw clenched. His mother looked shocked, his business associates uncomfortable, but Deborah felt only relief. Outside the courtroom, women she didn't know approached her, thanked her for her testimony, said they'd needed to see it, that they'd been in similar situations and hadn't known how to leave, that watching her refuse to settle had given them courage. Diana hugged her so hard they both nearly fell over. You did it. You actually did it. Olive was crying and laughing at once. I'm so proud of you, Mom. Becca just smiled. Welcome to the other side. Frank tried to approach in the courthouse hallway. Deborah, But Deborah kept walking. She had nothing left to say to him, his voice calling after her. Are you happy now? You've humiliated me. Faded behind her. She pushed through the courthouse doors into afternoon sunlight, flanked by the women who'd stood beside her, and felt something she hadn't felt in 27 years. She felt free. Chapter 5. 6 months later, Deborah stood in the doorway of her new apartment, a single bedroom on the 3rd floor of an older building near downtown. It wasn't fancy. The carpet was worn, the kitchen appliances dated, the bathroom small, but the lease was in her name. The furniture she'd carefully chosen from thrift stores and estate sales was hers. The plants on the windowsill that she was learning to keep alive were hers. Every dish, every book, every choice in this small space belonged to her alone. She'd furnished it slowly, deliberately. A couch from an estate sale, reupholstered in fabric she'd chosen herself, deep blue, not the neutrals Frank had insisted made the house look elegant. A kitchen table from a thrift store, scarred and solid, where she ate meals whenever she felt like eating them. Bookshelves she'd assembled herself, watching YouTube tutorials and feeling ridiculously proud when they stood straight. An armchair by the window where she read on Sunday mornings, drinking coffee that was exactly as strong as she liked it. The settlement money had been enough for first and last month's rent, basic furniture, and a savings account that gave her breathing room for the first time in her adult life. It wasn't wealth, but it was security she'd earned herself, in a battle she'd fought herself, for a life that was finally, completely hers. She still worked at the Community Literacy Center, now as full-time director. Becca had been promoted to regional coordinator, overseeing multiple centers, and had recommended Deborah for her position. The salary increase meant she could afford this apartment without constantly calculating every expense. It meant she could sometimes say yes when Olive suggested dinner out, could replace her worn work shoes when they needed it, could breathe without the constant weight of financial panic. But more than the money, the work itself sustained her. She'd expanded the program, secured 2 new grants, increased enrollment by 40%. She'd hired additional tutors and created a mentorship program pairing new learners with those who'd completed the program. The center had become a community hub, a place where people came not just to learn, but to be seen, valued, supported. Rosa had graduated from the literacy program 3 months ago. Deborah still remembered that celebration, watching Rosa stand in front of 30 people and read a passage from Maya Angelou, "Still I Rise." The symbolism hadn't been lost on anyone. After the ceremony, Rosa had pulled Deborah aside. "You know what the most important thing you taught me was? How to decode complex words." Rosa smiled. "No, you taught me that starting over isn't giving up. It's giving yourself another chance." They'd both cried then. These 2 women who'd learned to read their lives differently at 58 and 52. Marcus had earned his GED and enrolled in community college. Yolanda had improved her English enough to get promoted at work, then started volunteering at the center herself, helping other immigrants navigate systems she'd struggled through alone. Each success story reminded Deborah why she'd fought so hard to get here, why the apartment with worn carpet was better than the mansion where she'd disappeared. Her relationship with Olive had transformed completely. They had dinner together weekly now, sometimes at Deborah's apartment, sometimes at Olive's, sometimes at a restaurant neither could really afford, but they went anyway, because they wanted to, because they could. Their conversations went deep now, touching on things they'd never discussed when Deborah was married to Frank. Olive's work and social work, the patterns she saw in families, the way trauma passed through generations until someone was brave enough to break the cycle. "You broke it, Mom." Olive had said this just last week, sitting at Deborah's thrift store table, eating takeout Chinese food. "You showed me I didn't have to accept being treated badly just because someone called it love." Deborah had reached across the table, squeezed her daughter's hand. "That's the only thing I'm proud of from that marriage. Raising you. You should be proud of leaving too. I am. Now. It took time, but yes, I am." Diana visited every few months, staying in the apartment's small spare room that Deborah had set up with an air mattress and genuine excitement about hosting. They'd stay up late drinking wine and talking like they had in college, except now they talked about things that mattered, not just surface-level updates, but real conversations about fear and courage and what it meant to rebuild yourself when the foundation you'd built your life on turned out to be quicksand. The book club had evolved too. Deborah had started a new one at the Literacy Center, open to everyone, students, volunteers, community members. It was different from the old book club with its expensive wine and careful opinions. This group met in the center's community room, sitting on mismatched chairs, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, and talking honestly about what they read. Last month, they'd discussed Educated by Tara Westover, and the conversations about leaving the life you know for the life you need had left everyone raw and inspired. Some of the women from her old book club had reached out privately, months after the divorce was finalized. They'd been quiet during the battle, unsure whose side to take, uncomfortable with the public nature of Deborah's fight. But afterward, 3 of them had called or texted. "I didn't know," one said. "I thought you had the perfect marriage." Another admitted, "Watching you leave gave me permission to look at my own marriage differently." Deborah had been gracious, understanding, but she'd also learned that some friendships were based on convenience rather than connection. She was building new friendships now, based on honesty rather than performance. It was slower, harder, but infinitely more real. She ran into Frank occasionally. This was still a relatively small community, and they'd moved in the same circles for years. The first time had been at the grocery store, 3 months post-divorce. She'd turned a corner with her cart, and there he was, in the produce section, looking older and somehow smaller than she remembered. Deborah. He'd said her name carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to speak to her. Frank. She'd kept her voice neutral. "How are you?" The question seemed genuine, which surprised her. "I'm good, really, good." And she was. She'd lost 25 pounds of stress weight and gained something more valuable, peace. He'd nodded, looked like he might say more, then just walked away. She'd continued her shopping and only later realized her hands hadn't been shaking. She'd seen him and felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just the neutral recognition of someone who'd once been important, but was now just another person buying vegetables. The second encounter was at a community event, a fundraiser for the Literacy Center that Deborah had organized. Frank had shown up with a large donation check, handed it to her publicly. She'd thanked him professionally, accepted the check for the center, and moved on. Later, Diana had asked if it bothered her, him trying to look magnanimous. "Not really," Deborah had answered. "He can donate to good causes. That's between him and his conscience. I'm just glad the center benefits." She'd learned to separate herself from his choices, his narrative, his life. He was no longer the central figure in her story. He was a chapter she'd closed, painful but finished. Judith had called once, 6 months after the divorce was final. A stiff, formal apology that felt more obligatory than genuine. "I may have been too hard on you. Frank told me things that perhaps weren't entirely accurate." Deborah had accepted the apology gracefully, but hadn't pushed for a relationship. Some bridges were meant to burn. The real surprise had been Frank's brother, David, who'd reached out with a genuine apology. "I watched you shrink over the years and said nothing. I'm sorry, I should have spoken up." They'd met for coffee, had a real conversation, and David had admitted, "My marriage isn't great either. Watching you leave made me realize I've been making the same excuses Frank made, that providing financially was enough, that my wife should just be grateful. You taught me better." That's what Deborah was learning. Her story wasn't just hers. Every time she shared it, in court, with friends, with students who asked how she'd found the courage to start over, she gave someone else permission to consider their own situation differently. Her courage rippled outward in ways she'd never intended but had come to value deeply. She'd started therapy, working through 27 years of accommodation and self-erasure. Her therapist, a woman in her 60s who'd been through her own divorce, helped Deborah understand the patterns she'd learned in childhood, from her mother's early death, from her father's alcoholism, from growing up believing that keeping everyone else happy was the only way to ensure they wouldn't leave. Deborah was learning slowly that she could have needs, could voice them, could even prioritize them sometimes, without the world ending. It was hard work, harder than the divorce in some ways, because it required examining every belief she'd built her life around. But she was doing it, week after week, peeling back layers, understanding herself, rebuilding from the inside out. She'd even gone on a date, just one, set up by a well-meaning friend. A nice man, divorced himself, interesting and kind. But Deborah had realized halfway through dinner that she wasn't ready, might not be ready for a long time. And that was okay. She was finally learning to be alone without being lonely, to enjoy her own company, to build a life that didn't require another person to make it feel complete. When people asked if she was seeing anyone, she'd started answering, "I'm seeing myself clearly for the first time. Maybe someday I'll want a relationship, but right now I'm learning to date myself, to treat myself the way I deserve to be treated." Some people didn't understand, but the women who'd been through similar journeys, they got it. They'd nod knowingly, share their own stories of learning to be whole alone before trying to be part of a pair. This morning, the anniversary of the day she'd left Frank, Deborah had woken early and made herself a real breakfast. Not something quick and functional, but pancakes and bacon and fresh fruit, eaten slowly at her small table while reading the newspaper. It felt celebratory. 1 year of freedom, 1 year of building a life that was authentic instead of aspirational. Becca had texted earlier, 1 year, how does it feel? Deborah had typed and deleted several responses before settling on the truth, like coming home to myself. At work, there was a new student starting today. Marie, 48, recently divorced, signing up for the literacy program even though she clearly knew how to read. Deborah recognized the pattern. Sometimes people came to the center not because they couldn't read words, but because they needed help reading their own lives differently. After the orientation session, Marie had lingered. "Can I ask you something personal?" Deborah nodded. "How did you know you were strong enough? To leave, to start over, to survive all this?" Deborah thought about the question, about the shattered champagne glass and the 2 a.m. call to Diana and the job interview that changed everything and the courtroom where she'd refused to stay silent and every small, scared, brave step in between. "I didn't know," she answered honestly. "I was terrified every single day, but I did it anyway." Marie's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared too. Good. Being scared means it matters." Deborah squeezed Marie's hand. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and choosing yourself anyway. After Marie left, Deborah sat in her office. Yes, she had an office with her name on the door and photos of successful students covering the walls, and pulled out her journal. She'd started keeping one after the divorce, working through her feelings and writing like her therapist had suggested. She wrote, "A year ago today, I left a marriage that was killing me slowly. I had nothing. No money, no home, no certainty that I'd survive. Today, I have everything that matters. Not wealth, not status, but peace, authenticity, the ability to look in the mirror and recognize the woman looking back." She paused, pen hovering over paper, then continued. "They say you can't start over at 52. They say leaving means losing. They say staying quiet is safer. They're wrong. Starting over means gaining yourself back. Speaking truth is the safest thing you can do for your soul. And 52? That's just the beginning." That evening, she met Olive for dinner at a small Italian restaurant neither of them had been to before. Olive raised her water glass in a toast to 1 year of freedom. Deborah clinked her glass against her daughter's. To 1 year of choosing myself. "Mom, can I tell you something?" Olive's expression was serious, always. Growing up, watching you with Dad, I learned that love looked like sacrifice, like making yourself smaller so someone else could be bigger. I was in a relationship like that in college. I let this guy treat me the way Dad treated you because I thought that was normal. Deborah's heart sank. Olive, I'm so sorry. No, wait. Olive smiled. I left him. Because even though you were still with Dad then, even though you hadn't left yet, something you'd told me once stuck with me. You said, you teach people how to treat you. And I realized I was teaching him I'd accept being treated badly. When did I say that? I was 16. We were doing dishes together. I don't think you even remember, but it planted a seed. Olive reached across the table. And then, when you actually left Dad, when you chose yourself, even though it cost you everything, that's when the seed grew. You showed me that it's never too late to change the lesson you're teaching people about what you'll accept. They both cried a little, right there in the restaurant, not caring who saw. This, Deborah thought, is what it was all for. Not the money from the settlement or the apartment or even her own freedom, though those mattered. But this, her daughter learning that she deserved respect, that she could demand it, that leaving wasn't failure, but courage. Walking back to her car later, Deborah passed a kitchen store with champagne flutes displayed in the window. She stopped, looked at them, remembered the sound of crystal shattering against marble, remembered Michelle's laugh and Frank's command, and the woman who'd stood there thinking she was breaking when really she was breaking free. She smiled at her reflection in the store window. The woman looking back was older than the one who dropped that glass a year and a half ago. More lines around her eyes, more gray in her hair, but also more alive, more present, more completely, authentically herself. She continued to her car, her used Honda that she loved because she'd chosen it and paid for it and it was hers, and drove home to her small apartment with its thrift store furniture and thriving plants and walls that held only the things she wanted to see. Home. Not the biggest place she'd ever lived, not the most impressive, but the first place that had ever truly felt like hers. If Deborah's story reminds you that it's never too late to choose yourself, show some love by hitting subscribe. Drop a comment telling us about a time you found your voice. And remember, like Deborah learned, your worth was never up for debate. You've always been enough. That night, Deborah lay in her own bed in her own room and thought about the journey from there to here. From the woman who cleaned up broken glass on command to the woman who'd stood in a courtroom and refused to be silenced. From the woman who didn't know who she was without her husband to the woman who was building an identity, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. It hadn't been easy. There were still hard days, moments of doubt, times when the financial pressure felt overwhelming or the loneliness cut deep. But even on the worst days, she never regretted leaving, because the hardest day of freedom was still better than the best day of that comfortable cage. She thought about all the women who'd approached her after the trial, who'd thanked her for her testimony, who'd said her courage had given them permission to look at their own lives differently. She thought about Marie starting at the center, scared but showing up. She thought about Rosa learning to read at 58, proving that it's never too late. She thought about the question people kept asking. Was it worth it? Losing the house, the financial security, the life everyone envied? And finally, she had an answer that felt completely, honestly true. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because what she'd gained, her voice, her peace, her authentic self, was worth more than anything she'd lost. She'd spent 27 years as Frank's wife, shrinking and accommodating and disappearing piece by piece. Now she was spending however many years she had left being Deborah. Just Deborah. Flawed and scared and brave and real. And that woman, the real one, the honest one, the one who'd chosen truth over comfort and dignity over security, that woman was finally enough. The champagne glass had shattered. Everything had broken. And from those sharp, glittering fragments, she'd built something new, something true, something entirely her own. 52 wasn't too old to start over. It was just the perfect time to begin. She closed her eyes, finally at peace, and fell asleep in her small apartment where the door locked from the inside and every single thing was hers, and the only person she had to answer to was herself. Free. Finally, completely, gloriously free. And it turned out, freedom was exactly what enough felt like.